To state the obvious, Ultros is a visually stunning game. The sci-fi comic book style this title utilizes fits perfectly for this exploration-based metroidvania. While the combat may not be the main focus of this game, the exploration alone is worth it. It's the Dove here to give you a peek inside Ultros, an indie game made by Swedish developer Hadoque. This is Hadoque's first title to date. There are a few different game mechanics that make this a fun experience. The time cycles and the growing of plants are extremely interesting elements to add to this genre. There are extractors, which are the normal map opening tools you see in other Metroidvanias, but these tools can add a lot to the adventure. Once you get to the sprayer, digger, and splicer, you can really combine those to break the game wide open. And if you want to get one of the multiple endings, you will have to become well acquainted with their tricks. That brings us to the botany element, which might seem pointless at first, but has big ramifications for later in the game and for completionists. But I want to start off by saying that this game is for a certain type of person. And if you're going into this looking for a high-octane action combat game, this is not going to be it. But if you're looking for a Metroidvania that's a little more zen and a lot more chill, then this one might be up your alley. I personally suck at Metroidvanias. Trying to double jump with absolute perfect timing to get to a platform, or wall jumping for minutes on end, and if you make one tiny slip up in rhythm, it leaves you at the bottom of a tear-soaked corridor. No thank you. I still have nightmares of trying to perfectly time the bombs from Super Metroid with a broken controller to reach that promised land. That's one thing that Ultros did really well in my estimation. I think there was only one or two times where I absolutely had to do a wall jump or a perfectly timed double jump to get to a certain location. Other than that, you could pretty much build your way out of any tough spot. The botany aspect at first just seems like a long game to get to hard to reach places, or just ways to expand the map later on, forcing the player to go through certain levels. But after the initial few runs, you see that there's a lot more to it. You can get yourself both in and out of trouble with the planting, so extract and plant carefully. Along with the botany, the time loop is something you really have to plan ahead for. You can't completely ignore growing and taking care of the plants at the start of the game, and you can't ignore that you will lose everything in your inventory and all your moves that you haven't memorized. Now, I don't want to get too deep into all the different layers of the game because that's part of the fun of this, is to actually discover and figure out how some of these mechanics work. But the last element I really want to just briefly touch on is the fact that when you take an enemy down, you can gather and feast on the remains. It also replenishes your health and increases your character's attributes, which in turn allows you to unlock special abilities. The reason I wanted to bring it up is because all these systems in Ultros seem to be along the line of not only growing in renewal, but also of rebirth, recycling, and regeneration. I thought maybe I was reading a little bit too much into everything, but it looks like the developers actually had that in mind. The time loop element is supposed to symbolize karma. That just really scratches the surface about how deep this game really is, but it gives you an idea of how all the elements really have a lot of symbolism to them. Most Metroidvania tools are about destruction. You're always trying to break down a wall or destroy an obstacle that's in your way. Ultros really seems to be more about connecting and growth, which is a stark contrast to nearly all Metroidvanias. Again, I might be getting a little too metaphysical here, but I definitely like the vibe and how different it was from most games in this genre. The gameplay is smooth and responsive, which is exactly what you want in a title. It really helps in a game where you're focused on platforming and close quarters combat as well. So although the fighting isn't very abundant in the game, when you do need to fight, it feels natural. The counter system's just a little bit different. You have to slide underneath and then just use the counter button, not the attack. It's a little weird and wonky, but it's not a deal breaker. When you're platforming, it feels like you have good footing. In some of these games, when you land, it just feels very slippery, and this is not one of those games. Since you have to start from the beginning nearly every time you defeat a boss, it doesn't force you to double jump all day long. So that part of the game really isn't important. You definitely use it and will have to be able to pull off some double jumps here and there, but you can get through a majority of the map without it. Don't get me wrong, I love a good double jump. It's one of my favorite mechanics in all video games. But I just want to stress the fact that sometimes when you have to time them absolutely perfectly, it creates a source of anxiety that I don't even want to talk about on YouTube. The base enemies are pretty standard, and there isn't too much variation in them, but I feel like there are more unique bosses than those standard enemy types. Not the worst thing in the world, just stuck out a bit. The level designs are as unique as the many bosses that inhabit them. Although the game uses a recurring color palette, each level highlights different ranges of those colors, and it combines to one of the most visually remarkable games I've ever seen. With the different levels generally comes different seeds and sometimes a new enemy. The variation in plant life not only is aesthetically pleasing, but the variation really comes into play later on with some subtle game mechanics. I don't want to get too deep into it, as I said before, but sometimes you just have to plant a seed and kind of figure out what the benefit is. But dare I say, with a lot of the elements in this game, you have to kind of figure it out as you go. There are some explainers here and there, but even for people who understand the English language well, you're still going to have a lot of questions after the descriptions from the game. That's just one of those very divisive parts of a game. Some people really like that guided experience, while others really love to explore and figure things out through experimentation. The story really gives an Hideo Kojima kind of vibe where you are always trying to figure out what the hell is going on. The unnamed main player wakes up in a spaceship called the Sarcophagus, which holds the demon Ultros in it. This time-looping ship is filled with aliens and other life forms and seems to reset every time you defeat a boss or enter Ultros' chamber. You eventually have to figure out what's going on and how to deal with Ultros. But that is a very, very simplified version of what's going on. The music is really chill, and I would describe it as ambient sounds. There are some songs going on here and there, and there is a theme to the game, but for the most part, when you go in between screens and level, it's more about the ambiance than it is the actual soundtrack. The developers actually sent part of their team down to the Amazon rainforest to capture some sounds. Then they recreated it and put their own twist on things to make the beautiful sounds that you get in Ultros. That again just ties into the mood of the game, which I would almost certainly describe as very chill. There is some aggression, and there are fights where you're going to tense up, but going from place to place, exploring the map, listening to the sounds, and trying to figure out how to connect things, the game is more about opening your mind and relaxing than it is mashing buttons. I really enjoyed this game, but it's not without its flaws, however. Late in the game, after they introduce multiple extractors, which are basically the tools to help the botany mechanics in the game, some of those tools just don't quite work like I think the developers intended. I'm going to be talking about one tool in particular, the splicer, which is a very powerful tool in the game, and it allows you to take properties from one plant and just plop it on to another. This tool is extremely hard to control. The good news is that the extractors really aren't used in combat at all, but it doesn't forgive the fact that these are some of the most finicky controls I have used in a long time. I generally am not a completionist, but for some games I really like to go the extra mile and just see what the game has to offer. But after dealing with the splicer for hours, I just had to give up trying to get to all the secret spots in the game. The lack of variation in combat, both in enemy and moves list, was another aspect that needed some work. I understand that with the time loop they wanted to keep the moves list short, but I really think they needed to add just one or two more moves to change things up, along with a much needed ranged attack. You can propel enemies that you just hit into other enemies, causing pretty gnarly explosions, but the game still was lacking a solid ranged attack in my opinion. But those are just a few little nitpicks in an otherwise really interesting and enjoyable game. Like I said, I wasn't a big Metroidvania fan, but this may have brought me around. I really enjoyed the exploration aspect, and the puzzles the game throws at you are subtly the best part. This is by no means a puzzle game, and I would even argue that there are only one or two true puzzles that you need to figure out in order to progress, but most of the optional paths are a lot of fun to figure out. This game is beautiful and makes an intoxicating atmosphere. Although I think this may be too simple combat-wise for some dedicated fans of the genre, it is an incredibly enjoyable title for those willing to see what is going on under the surface. If the artwork brought you in and you're just looking for a good game, check out Ultros. It's available on PlayStations, PC, and Mac. Folks, if you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you'd like more content like this. For even more content, go to twohatsandabeard.com or check out our YouTube page. Until next time, this is the Dove.